The year was 1776, and the air in the American colonies was thick with tension. The British Crown's grip on the colonies had tightened, and the people were suffocating under the weight of taxes and oppression. In the small town of Lexington, Massachusetts, a young farmer named Samuel Thompson stood in his field, staring at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the land, but Samuel's mind was far from the beauty of the evening. He clenched his fists, feeling the calluses on his hands that had worked the land for years, hands that had built a life from nothing. But now that life was under threat. Samuel's father, John Thompson, had fought in the French and Indian War, and he had returned home with stories of bravery and sacrifice. He had always told Samuel that freedom was worth fighting for, that it was worth dying for. Samuel had listened, but he had never truly understood until now. The British soldiers had come to Lexington, demanding supplies and loyalty, and they had taken what they wanted without regard for the people who had worked so hard to build their lives. Samuel had seen the fear in his neighbors' eyes, the anger in their hearts. He had felt it himself. The sound of hoofbeats broke Samuel's reverie, and he turned to see his friend, Thomas Whitaker, riding toward him. Thomas was a blacksmith, a man of strength and determination, and his face was set in a grim expression as he dismounted and approached Samuel. "They've done it," Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. "The British have marched on Concord. They're seizing our arms, our supplies. They mean to crush us before we can even rise." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard the whispers of rebellion, the calls for independence, but now it was real. The British were not just oppressors, they were invaders, and they were coming for everything the colonists had built. "What do we do?" Samuel asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. Thomas placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his grip firm. "We fight," he said. "We fight for our homes, for our families, for our freedom. We fight because if we don't, we lose everything." Samuel nodded, his fear giving way to determination. He had always been a man of peace, a man who believed in the power of hard work and perseverance. But now he understood that there were some things worth fighting for, some things worth sacrificing for. The two men hurried to the town square, where a crowd had gathered. The air was electric with tension, and the voices of the people rose in a cacophony of anger and fear. At the center of the crowd stood a man named Paul Revere, his face set in a determined expression as he addressed the people. "The British are coming," Revere said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "They mean to take our arms, our supplies, our freedom, but we will not let them. We will stand together and we will fight for our rights, for our liberty, for our future." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Samuel felt a surge of pride and determination. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a soldier, a defender of his home and his people. He joined the militia, along with Thomas and dozens of other men from Lexington and the surrounding towns. They were not trained soldiers, but they were determined, and they were willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom. The next morning, as the sun rose over Lexington, Samuel stood with his fellow militiamen on the town green. The air was crisp and cold, and the tension was palpable. They had heard the British were coming, and they were ready. Samuel gripped his musket tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He thought of his father, of the stories he had told of bravery and sacrifice. He thought of his mother, of the life they had built together. He thought of the future, of the freedom they were fighting for. And then they came. The British soldiers marched into Lexington, their red coats bright against the morning light. They were disciplined, well-trained, and heavily armed. Samuel felt a moment of doubt, a moment of fear, but then he looked at the men around him, at their determined faces, and he knew that they would not back down. The British commander, a man named Major John Pitcairn, stepped forward and demanded that the militiamen disperse, but the militiamen stood their ground, their muskets at the ready. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the command to fire, and then it happened. A shot rang out, and the world erupted into chaos. The British soldiers opened fire, and the militiamen returned it. Samuel fired his musket, reloaded, and fired again. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the shouts of the men. Samuel fought with everything he had, his fear giving way to a fierce determination. He was fighting for his home, for his family, for his freedom. The battle was short but brutal. The militiamen were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with a courage and determination that surprised the British. Samuel saw Thomas fall, a British bayonet piercing his chest, and he felt a surge of anger and grief. He fought harder, his musket blazing, until the British finally retreated. As the smoke cleared, Samuel stood on the green, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both British and American. Samuel looked around at the men who had fought beside him, at the faces of those who had given their lives for the cause of freedom. He felt a deep sense of loss, but also a sense of pride. They had stood their ground, and they had fought for what they believed in. The Battle of Lexington was just the beginning. The American Revolution had begun, and Samuel knew that there would be more battles, more sacrifices, but he also knew that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, for a future where they could be free. As he stood on the green, Samuel made a silent vow. He would fight for as long as it took. He would sacrifice whatever was necessary to ensure that the dream of freedom became a reality. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Samuel was ready. He was willing to give everything for the cause of liberty, and so the seeds of sacrifice were sown. The American people had taken their first steps toward becoming a nation, toward becoming a superpower, but the road to greatness would be paved with blood, sweat, and tears. The sacrifices had only just begun. The years that followed the Battle of Lexington were a crucible for the fledgling nation. The American Revolution raged on, and the sacrifices of the people grew heavier with each passing day. Samuel Thompson, now a seasoned soldier, had seen more battles than he could count. He had watched friends fall, had felt the sting of loss, and had endured the hardships of war. But through it all, he held on to the belief that their sacrifices would not be in vain. The winter of 1777 was particularly brutal. Samuel and his regiment were encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, under the command of General George Washington. The conditions were dire. The men were poorly clothed, many without shoes, and food was scarce. The cold was relentless, biting through their thin uniforms and freezing the ground beneath their feet. Disease ran rampant through the camp, and the men were weak and weary. Samuel sat by a small fire, trying to warm his hands. His breath came out in white puffs, and he could feel the chill deep in his bones. He looked around at the men in his regiment, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. They were all suffering, but they endured. They endured because they believed in the cause, because they believed in the dream of a free nation. A young soldier named James, barely 16 years old, sat beside Samuel. His hands were wrapped in rags, and his face was pale from hunger. "Do you think we'll make it through this winter, Samuel?" James asked, his voice trembling. Samuel looked at the boy, his heart aching for him. James was too young to be here, too young to be suffering like this, but he was here, and he was fighting just like the rest of them. Samuel placed a hand on James's shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll make it," Samuel said, his voice firm despite his own doubts. "We've come too far to give up now. We'll endure this, and we'll keep fighting. We have to." James nodded, but his eyes were filled with uncertainty. Samuel understood. He felt it too. The winter was long, and the future was uncertain, but they had to hold on. They had to believe that their sacrifices would lead to something greater. As the weeks dragged on, the men at Valley Forge were pushed to their limits. But amidst the suffering, there was also hope. General Washington worked tirelessly to keep the army together, to keep their spirits alive. He brought in new supplies, organized training drills, and instilled a sense of discipline and purpose in the men. Samuel admired Washington's leadership, his unwavering determination. It gave him strength even in the darkest moments. One evening, as Samuel sat by the fire, he was approached by a man named Benjamin Tallmadge, a young officer who had become a close friend. Benjamin's face was serious as he sat down beside Samuel. "We've received word from the Continental Congress," Benjamin said, his voice low. "They're struggling to keep the army supplied. The funds are running out and the people are growing weary of the war." Samuel frowned, his heart sinking. He had heard the rumors, the whispers of discontent among the people. The war had dragged on for years and the sacrifices had been immense, but he had hoped that the people would continue to support the cause, that they would understand the importance of what they were fighting for. "What does this mean for us?" Samuel asked, his voice heavy with concern. Benjamin sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means we have to keep fighting no matter what. We have to show the people that we can win, that their sacrifices are not in vain. If we can just hold on a little longer, if we can just keep pushing forward, we can turn the tide." Samuel nodded, his resolve hardening. He had come too far to give up now. He had lost too much to let it all be for nothing. He would keep fighting no matter how hard it got. The winter finally began to loosen its grip, and with the arrival of spring came new hope. The men at Valley Forge had endured the worst of it, and they emerged stronger, more determined. General Washington's leadership had kept them together, and they were ready to take the fight to the British once more. In June of 1778, Samuel and his regiment marched out of Valley Forge, their spirits lifted by the promise of a new campaign. They were heading to Monmouth, New Jersey, where they would face the British in a pivotal battle. The heat of summer was intense, and the march was grueling, but the men pressed on. They had endured the cold of winter. They could endure the heat of summer. The Battle of Monmouth was fierce and chaotic. The British forces, led by General Sir Henry Clinton, were well trained and well equipped, but the American soldiers fought with a ferocity born of desperation and determination. determination. Samuel found himself in the thick of the fighting, his musket blazing as he charged forward with his fellow soldiers. The air was filled with the roar of cannon fire, the crack of muskets, and the screams of the wounded. Samuel fought with everything he had, his body moving on instinct, his mind focused on the task at hand. He saw men fall around him, their bodies crumpling to the ground, but he kept going. He had to keep going. He had to fight for the dream of freedom, for the future of his nation. As the battle raged on, Samuel found himself face to face with a British soldier. The man was young, his face pale with fear, but he raised his bayonet and charged at Samuel. Samuel reacted quickly, dodging the attack and driving his own bayonet into the soldier's chest. The man fell to the ground, his eyes wide with shock, and Samuel felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to kill, but he had no choice. This was war, and in war, there were no easy choices. The battle lasted for hours, but in the end, the American forces held their ground. The British were forced to retreat, and the Americans claimed a hard-fought victory. Samuel stood on the battlefield, his chest heaving, his body aching with exhaustion. He looked around at the carnage, at the bodies of the fallen, and he felt a deep sense of sorrow. So many lives lost, so much blood spilled, but they had won. They had held their ground, and they had shown the British that they would not be easily defeated. As the sun set over the battlefield, Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. They had endured the worst of the war, and they were still standing. They had sacrificed so much, but they were closer to victory than ever before. The road ahead would still be difficult, but Samuel believed that they could win. They had to win. The sacrifices of the American people were immense, but they were not in vain. The dream of freedom was alive, and it was worth fighting for. Samuel knew that the road to becoming a superpower would be paved with blood and sacrifice, but he was willing to give everything for the cause. The crucible of war had tested them, but it had also forged them into something stronger, something greater, and so the fight continued. The American people pressed on, their determination unshaken, their resolve unbroken. The sacrifices were far from over, but they were one step closer to their dream, one step closer to becoming a nation, a superpower, one step closer to freedom. The year was 1781, and the American Revolution was reaching its climax. The sacrifices of the past years had been immense, but the dream of freedom was within reach. Samuel Thompson, now a battle-hardened veteran, stood on the banks of the York River in Virginia, gazing out at the British forces encamped at Yorktown. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of the moment was palpable. This was it, the final push, the battle that would determine the fate of the fledgling nation. Samuel's regiment was part of the combined American and French forces under the command of General George Washington and General Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau. The French had been crucial allies, providing much-needed supplies, troops, and naval support. Without them, the Americans would have struggled to stand against the might of the British Empire. But now, with their combined strength, they had the British cornered at Yorktown. Samuel looked around at the men in his regiment. They were weary, their faces lined with the toll of years of war, but their eyes burned with determination. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to falter now. Samuel felt a surge of pride as he thought of all they had endured, the bitter winters, the bloody battles, the loss of friends and comrades. It had all led to this moment. The plan was set. The French fleet, under the command of Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse, had blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off the British forces from reinforcements and supplies. The American and French armies had marched south from New York, trapping the British at Yorktown. Now they would lay siege to the British forces, forcing them to surrender. The siege began in earnest. The American and French forces dug trenches and erected artillery batteries, bombarding the British positions day and night. The sound of cannon fire was constant, a relentless roar that shook the ground and filled the air with smoke and debris. Samuel and his regiment were in the thick of it, digging trenches, manning the cannons, and repelling British sorties. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline. Samuel's body ached from the constant labor, his hands blistered and raw from digging, but he pushed through the pain, driven by the knowledge that this was the final push. The end was in sight. One night, as Samuel sat in the trenches trying to catch a few moments of rest, he was approached by Benjamin Talmadge. Benjamin's face was grim, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We've received word from General Washington," Benjamin said, his voice low. "The British are running out of supplies. Their defenses are weakening. If we can keep up the pressure, they'll have no choice but to surrender." Samuel nodded, his heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. They were so close to victory. But he knew that the final push would be the hardest. The British would not go down without a fight. The days turned into weeks, and the siege wore on. The British forces, under the command of General Charles Cornwallis, were desperate. They launched several sorties trying to break through the American and French lines, but each time they were repelled. The American and French forces held firm, their determination unshaken. Finally, on October 17th, 1781, the British sent a messenger under a flag of truce. Samuel watched as the messenger approached the American lines, his heart pounding in his chest. Could this be it? Could the British finally be ready to surrender? The message was clear. General Cornwallis was ready to negotiate terms of surrender. The American and French commanders agreed to a ceasefire, and the negotiations began. Samuel and his regiment stood watch, their eyes fixed on the British positions, their hands gripping their muskets tightly. They were so close, but they couldn't let their guard down. Not yet. The negotiations lasted for 2 days, but finally, on October 19th, the terms were agreed upon. The British would surrender. The war was over. Samuel stood with his regiment as the British forces marched out of Yorktown, their colours cased, their heads bowed in defeat. The American and French forces lined the road, their faces filled with a mixture of pride and relief. The British soldiers laid down their arms, and the American flag was raised over Yorktown. Samuel felt a surge of emotion as he watched the flag rise. It was a moment he would never forget. The sacrifices, the pain, the loss, it had all been worth it. They had won. They had achieved the impossible. They had defeated the mightiest empire in the world and won their freedom. As the reality of the victory sank in, Samuel felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. He thought of all the men who had fought and died for this dream. He thought of Thomas, who had fallen at Lexington, and James, who had succumbed to disease at Valley Forge. He thought of all the friends and comrades he had lost along the way. They had given everything for this moment, and Samuel knew that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. The road ahead would not be easy. The new nation would face countless challenges as it sought to build a government, establish laws, and create a society based on the principles of freedom and equality. But Samuel believed in the dream. He believed in the future of the United States of America. As he stood on the battlefield at Yorktown, Samuel made a silent vow. He would honor the sacrifices of those who had fallen by dedicating his life to the new nation. He would work to build a country that was worthy of their sacrifices, a country that would stand as a beacon of freedom and hope for the world. The birth of a nation had come at a great cost, but it was a cost that Samuel and his fellow patriots had been willing to pay. The United States of America was born from the sacrifices of its people, and it would rise to become a superpower, a nation that would shape the course of history. And so, the story of the American sacrifices to become a superpower began. The road to greatness was paved with blood, sweat, and tears, but it was a road that led to freedom, to hope, to a future filled with endless possibilities. The sacrifices of the past had laid the foundation for a nation that would endure, a nation that would inspire the world. The dream of freedom had become a reality, and the United States of America was ready to take its place on the world stage.